Good evening, everybody. I want to call the October 26, 2017 meeting of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel to order. My name is Kate O'Connor, and I am the chair of the panel, and I'm a citizen member appointed by the governor. And what I want to do is ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. And Chris Campney, why don't we start on your end?
Chris Campany, Wyndham Regional Commission.
David Dean, at-large member appointed by the Speaker.
Laura Sibilia, member of the House Energy and Technology Committee, appointed by the Speaker.
David Andrews, representing the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Jim Matto, citizen member appointed by the Senate President Pro Tem.
Martin Langeveld, citizen member appointed by the governor.
Peter Walk, Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources.
Katie Buckley, Commissioner of Housing and Community Development, representing the Agency of Commerce and Community Development.
Lissa Weinman,
June
Citizen
Tierney.
Representative. Oh, sorry.
You
Go ahead, June, go.
June Tierney, Department of Public Service.
Lissa Weinman, Citizen Representative, appointed by the Senate President Pro Tem.
Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon.
Derek Jordan, citizen member, appointed by Secretary of State.
Mike McKinney, Technical Coordinator for Decommissioning, Entergy, Vermont Yankee.
Good evening, I'm Jack Boyle. I'm the Decommissioning Director at Vermont Yankee, representing Entergy.
Thank you very much.
We got one more. It's Bob Gustafson, representing the state of New Hampshire.
We have Bob Gustafson, and I think, is Bill Irwin there?
Bill's supposed to be on the line, but it doesn't look like he's checked in yet.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Bob. We can hear you, and hopefully you can hear us. Perfect. We have everyone has the agenda in front of them, but I'll go through quickly for the public. We're going to have a regular update from Entergy and a regular update from the state of Vermont. Then we're going to have two presentations this evening. The first is a technical assistance for Brownfields review of non-radiological site restoration proposal at VY. Then we're going to have an overview by 4 of the intervenors in the Public Utility Commission Docket 880. Then we're going to talk about 2017 and a little bit about 2018. I would like to now go to approving the minutes of the September 28th, 2017 meeting. Does anybody have any comments or corrections to the minutes?
Yes, this is Bob Gustafson.
Hi, Bob.
It says in the minutes that I was on last month, and I was not. I was actually transiting by airplane from Washington, D.C. while the meeting was on.
Okay, great. Thank you for being honest.
Well, I have one more item too. It states in the minutes that I was appointed by my governor. I was actually filling in the position for Diane Becker, who is retired. I've taken over her responsibility. So I have not directly been appointed by the governor. I've been appointed by my director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. However, I talked to my director today, and he said he will get me an appointment directly from our governor if he feels it's needed at this time.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll make note of that in the minutes.
Okay.
Did David Dean have was that?
Yes, page 12, line 7 going to line 8. It's not what other stakeholders, but what other state, STAKEHOLDERS.
Where is that?
Page 12, end of line 7 on to line 8.
Oh, yes, gotcha. Thank you. Was there another one? David Andrews.
I have a couple. Page 2, line 19. I believe we're speaking about a tanker, not a tankard.
Yep. Never know. Okay.
Page 3, line 27. Just a clarification here. The line before it reads, Entergy and North Star have responded and state did a reply filing.
Mhm.
We're talking about the state of Vermont as opposed to Scott State.
That's correct.
And page 5, line 13, it's aggregate,
Mhm.
not arrogate. Page 7, line 10, partway in it says, referring to 10 mg for milligrams. I believe we're talking about millirem, so it should be MR. And just for clarity, page 9, line 31, it says question, but it doesn't say who the question came from. And I'm not sure who it is. That's it.
Is that good? Does anyone else have any comments or corrections to the minutes?
On page 9.
Wait, we use, Jim, we use the mic.
Sorry. On page 9, line 13, should that be graded, not graded? At the end of line 13?
I can check, yeah, I can check, just to
And
confirm.
the same word is on line 17.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we'll check on that. All right, does anyone else have any more comments or corrections to the minutes? Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes as corrected? We have a motion to move to approve the minutes as corrected. Would anyone like to second that motion? Martin has seconded it. All right, we have a motion to approve the minutes as corrected. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right. All right, thank you. We have the minutes approved. I guess we're ready for Joe Lynch, if he's going to be giving the update from Entergy.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everyone. Just a brief update since the last time we met on some of the major activities that we're working on at the site. If you can go to the third slide, please. Thank you. In regards to the ongoing dry fuel storage project, we have now loaded 16 canisters thus far in our 2017 campaign. That's a total of 29 complete and stored on the pads. We continue to load about 1 canister a week as the average. However, in a couple weeks, we'll be going into a planned maintenance window where we'll go through and do preventive maintenance on certain equipment. That'll last approximately 3 weeks. So you'll see kind of a slowdown in the 1 per week progress, but again, that's part of our plan. And of course, all of our fuel is targeted to be completely transferred from wet to dry by the end of 2018, assuming that we have certain NRC approvals along the way. At the last meeting, I kind of went over in a little more detail some of the future work that we're doing at the site. One of them is a reduction in the site protected area. We'll go from our current protected area to what we call our ISFAC only protected area. We now have received all the permits that we need to start construction, 5 out of the 6 total. The last permit is associated with the tie-in of the septic system for the new building that we're constructing, so that's not needed to begin construction. So we will be starting construction on that particular change to the site configuration in November. We, of course, still need NRC approval of the proposed changes to our physical security plan. I will note at the last meeting, I believe it was a question from Dr. Irwin regarding whether the changes to the physical security plan would include provisions for meeting 10 CFR Part 37. So if we store nuclear material on the site, we have certain requirements regarding security of that material, and indeed the changes to our physical security plan take that into consideration. So while we're very focused on closing in on the protected area for the fuel, we'll also continue to have security over the other parts of the site commensurate with the changes to our plan, so I wanted to address that. And the targeted completion for the new protected area is going to be at the end of 2018 after we've completed the fuel transfer. Next slide, please. And just a reminder, this is a picture of an artist's rendering, if you will, of what the new configuration would look like with the new fences and a perimeter around the spent fuel storage areas, and the structure off to the left is the security diesel generator, which is in place, which will be backup power for that entire protected area. Next slide, please. This is a current picture of the dry fuel storage installation, both pads. Very recent picture that was taken. It shows a combination of canisters that have been loaded onto the pad as well as canisters that are staged to be loaded. Off in the right-hand side, you see a crane that's setting up to pour the concrete into the overpacks, or the high storms, as we call them, part of the system. So as these are received, we pour the concrete here on the site and get those ready for receiving fuel as we load each canister. Next slide, please. As far as water management, just a couple updates here. We have completed another effort to further reduce the amount of intrusion into the lower elevations of the turbine building. Some sealing efforts were completed recently. It generally takes a little bit of time before we can quantify what exactly the in leakage is, but currently it's somewhere between 500 and 600 gallons per day, which is a drastic reduction from where we were a couple of years ago when we first encountered this problem. So the combination of continuing to seal up known leaks and shipping water off site is how we're managing that intrusion water. We are still doing approximately 1 shipment per week being sent down to Energy Solutions facility in Tennessee. And to date, we have shipped a total of 608,000 gallons off-site. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just a quick update, because I'm certain that Department of Public Service will also provide a more detailed update, but recent milestones over the last month having to do with the Docket 8880 proceedings for the transaction. We completed responses to the petitioner's first round of discovery requests. Depositions were held over a 2-week period. And we also completed submittal of the petitioner's rebuttal testimony. Upcoming milestones, Monday we'll receive the 3rd and final round of discovery requests for either Entergy or North Star. Responses to those are due on November 17th. Then we'll have the non-petitioner's rebuttal testimony. That's due on December 1st. An important milestone mentioned at the last meeting is the next and final public meeting that will be held by the Public Utility Commission. That's scheduled for January 4th, although I haven't heard that the location is confirmed, likely to be at the Vernon Elementary School. And then the next major milestone will be the technical hearings, which are starting January 22nd and could go a couple of weeks. So the last 2 weeks in January are reserved for those. As far as the NRC license transfer application update, really no change from the last meeting. We're still waiting for a commission decision on the request for hearing by the state of Vermont New England Coalition. We're expecting that sometime in the 4th quarter, but no precise date. And there really hasn't been any other updates. The NRC continues to review the application and going through the process of providing us with any follow-up questions. We have not received any to date. Next slide. Next slide. Regarding the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust, reported at the end of August, the trust fund was at $574.6 million. A month later, it's up to 575.6. That's due to continued favorable market gains offset by the qualified withdrawals that we've made from the trust fund. Thus far this year, we have made $25.9 million in qualified withdrawals. We've had $42.9 million in market gains, and we've paid $3 million in fund expenses. The last trust that we've been tracking is our Site Restoration Trust. The current balance as the end of September was just under $25 million. Thus far, Entergy has contributed $20 million to that fund. So we've seen nearly $5 million in fund growth. And the last and final payment is due at the end of this year. So a total of $25 million that'll be going into the Site Restoration Trust. And then finally, we continue our outreach. The only thing I'll mention is that we continue to improve upon our website, vydecommissioning.com. It's been both restructures format-wise, it has search capabilities, and we've been adding additional documents as they become available and renaming some of the previous documents so that it's easier to find them. But this is really part of our outreach, and it's a tool for all of you. So if you'd like to provide us any feedback on things that you think are working particularly well, or more importantly, areas that we can improve, we would more than welcome any feedback based on anyone who uses the website. And then the last thing I wanted to cover, there was one additional question, I think provided by, again, Dr. Irwin, and this was whether or not the cost estimates take into consideration that when we ultimately have to move fuel from the dry fuel storage at the site off to some either federal repository or interim storage facility, how would we do that, and how is it being considered in the cost estimate? And I had mentioned that we would be constructing some sort of transfer facility to accommodate offloading the canisters onto some sort of intermodal device that would transport it to either Yucca or other places. And those costs are reflected in both the original cost estimate, and I think Scott said at the last meeting he had that reflected in his estimate as well. So I wanted to address that question from the last meeting.
Thank you, Joe. We're going to have an update from the state of Vermont, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the panel. And I don't know, it's going to be Steph Hoffman. Hi, Steph.
Hello, thank you so much for having me again.
Thanks for coming back.
So we're in a process right now of engaging in some more questioning of the petitioners, and that will be forward facing to our second and final round of testimony that the state and other intervening parties will file. So I thought, because I know Joe Lynch does his line-by-line scheduling update, that I'd step back and kind of explain where in the process we are currently, and hopefully that would create some context for your questions during that period. But as all of you know, the petition was filed in December. That included the petitioners jointly filing testimony supporting that petition. The state and all the intervening parties then came to the table and began a questioning process, which we referred to multiple times as the discovery phase. That culminated after 2 rounds of written questions with a deposition period for the first full 2 weeks of October, where the state, both the state of Vermont, all of the state parties and any intervenors who wish to participate were able to ask live questions of the witnesses that had offered testimony in this case. And that took primarily place during the first week of October. Some of those days with various of the testifying witnesses lasted over 10 hours, and some of them were only a regular 7 or 8 hour period of the workday. After that process took place the first week this month, we went into a second phase where they were able to turn around, they being North Star and Entergy, and ask questions of the state's witnesses who had filed testimony at the end of August. All of that was done live. After that process concluded, the petitioners filed rebuttal testimony, which is their second and last opportunity to file written, sort of sworn information in this docket. And that was filed on October 17th. Now the state agencies and the intervenors have an opportunity to file again written questions regarding that, and we're engaging in that, and that's what you heard Joe Lynch say. We have till Monday to provide those questions of the petitioners. They then have to answer those questions again in writing, and then the state agencies are also engaged in, and the intervening parties, should they wish to, provide a second round and final round of written testimony, which will be due on December 1st. We will then spend the month of December receiving questions about that testimony in written form. There's another period for depositions in January, which may or may not take place. That's the live questioning, again, depending on if the parties have questions for that process. And we will have the public hearing at the beginning of January here in Vernon after all of that testimony is filed. So at that point, there will be no further testimony filed in this case. And we will begin the live portion of the hearings at the end of January. That's the ultimate culmination before the board would, the commission would issue a decision in this case. So right now we're in a period where it might seem like a lull to those observing, but it's an extremely intense work period where we're engaging in final questions to the petitioners and preparations of the final statement that will be made by the state agencies and the intervening parties. I do want to stress during my time too as part of this update, because I think it's really important and seems very inaccessible to a lot of people, but the commission underwent a process, and I've mentioned this several times, to digitize the filings that come into the commission, and the EPUC website is available to any member of the public. It's available to any participant in the docket who wants to observe. You can even sign up to create a link to your own email that would update you if things are filed or provided in the docket. And I strongly suggest that if you're interested in reading materials, that's a great starting point. It's not the most intuitive organizational structure, but certainly give me a ring and I'll try to direct you on that website if you need further help. The clerks, I know at the commission, are quite overwhelmed with the transition still, but we're trying to make access part of the process. So thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Does anyone on the panel have any questions for either Joe Lynch or Steph Hoffman, or possibly anyone else from the state? Derek.
I have a question for Joe. It's just a question about the groundwater intrusion. So first of all, I mean, this has been going on for quite a long time. I was curious if you could tell me, if, in your memory, how long it's been happening that you've been dealing with this issue.
Well, essentially, shortly after we shut down the plant in the end of 2014, so the early part of 2015, when buildings started to get cool and there was no power production going on, we noticed the increase in intrusion water into the lower elevations of the turbine building.
Right, and I saw that in the materials that you had already shipped 600,000 gallons off. And I think you said in your talk today that you were experiencing 600 gallons a day still coming into the plant.
That's correct, between 500 and 600.
So, I'm just curious where you think it's coming. Where's it coming from?
Well, this building is 30 feet below grade, and the groundwater table is about 15 to 18 feet below grade. So the lower elevations of the turbine building are constantly under a hydraulic pressure. So there's water up against the sides and bottoms of that facility, all the time. Whether it's you have seasonal changes in elevation or not, you're always having that pressure. This building also had sumps that were into the ground that collected water in the building, and then we used to process that. We no longer process water, so any small little cracks and crevices, water finds its way into the most small areas, are collected in these sumps, and that's where we can calculate how much we're getting into the building. So as we identify areas that We see where the water's coming in. We go through and assess how to isolate it by either leak sealing or other methods, and that's what we've been doing for, essentially the last 2
quite a
years.
while.
Yep.
So I'm assuming you're testing the water inside when it comes in.
Correct.
And that's why you're shipping it out, because you're finding it contaminated to some extent. Is the water outside of the building also contaminated?
We don't believe so, because we have groundwater monitoring wells all around the site, and the groundwater wells in that area indicate that it's clean water.
Right.
So when the water comes in contact with the building and the sumps, it picks up small amounts of radioactivity, and that's the reason why we have to ship it off as waste.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question.
Sure.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have any questions for either Joe or someone from the state? Oh, Lisa.
Sorry. So this question is also for Joe, related to the groundwater leakage. You mentioned to date there's been 608,000 gallons shipped off-site. I'm just wondering, do you have a cost estimate for how much that's costed Entergy, and where's the money for shipping that off coming from?
I don't have a precise number, but I believe that the transportation and disposal costs are somewhere in the vicinity of $4 a gallon. So if you do the math, $2.5 million, and it's because it's radiologically related, it comes out of the trust fund. And there was a budget in the trust fund for water intrusion, water management when we put the cost estimate together.
Okay.
So we had provisions for that.
And I had another question that's slightly off topic, but has Entergy or any of the other nuclear operators taken a position on Congressman Welch's legislation to provide compensation for reactor communities that are housing waste?
Entergy has not taken any position on it. We'll be, following, how that proceeds, but we have not taken any official position on it one way or the other.
Are you in the process of determining whether you will take a position on that legislation?
At this point, we've read it, and we have really no comment or reaction on it. We were asked the same question in Massachusetts, and that at this point, that's where we are. If something changes, I'm sure we'll come out with a revised kind of opinion or comment. But at this point, we're in review, as I think a lot of people are, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I would urge you to take a position on that legislation. Thank you.
Appreciate your input.
David D.
Just a quick follow-up. Which trust fund is that $2.5 million coming out of?
Out of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund.
Decommissioning, not the site.
No, because it's radiologically, it's disposing of radiological materials.
I had one other question for Stephanie Hoffman.
Steph Hoffman.
It's just regarding the public hearing in January. You mentioned it was going to happen here in Vernon, but obviously we're here in Brattleboro now, and I think the previous public hearing took place in Vernon. Has that been determined that the public hearing will also be in Vernon again, not Brattleboro?
The current schedule says Vernon. The particular location has not yet been confirmed, but based on the location for the last one, the assumption currently is that it will be at the elementary school, unless something changes, accessibility or whether that date and Vernon are the intended location.
And who makes that decision regarding where the meeting's actually held?
The commission would make any decisions on the final location.
Okay, thank you.
Peter.
Question for Joe. Just sorry to make you pop up and down again, but you mentioned that the water intrusion was budgeted for at some level. Do you have an understanding of what the difference between what was budgeted for and what is the actual occurrence? How that compares, and whether or not there's a significant difference?
I don't have a comparison of what was budgeted versus what we've spent. I can certainly look that up and report back to the panel if that's
I think that would be a
follow-up question. Sure.
Sorry to keep making people get up and down. Staff, you don't need, I don't have a lot of experience for the Public Utilities Commission, but it's feeling like these technical hearings may be longer in duration or have to cover more ground than like even the certificate of public good technical hearings. Do you have any sense of that yet, about what we're looking at probably in January?
The only thing we know is that the commission has reserved 2 weeks. The second week has been labeled as an if necessary week. I think the commission is trying to anticipate scheduling this so that that time is reserved in anticipation of what the maximum necessary time would be, without refining the proceeding until we get to that point. Typically, the commission is asked a week or two in advance of a proceeding, and I'm talking specifically since it became the commission, but it has been past practice as well, but for the parties to then designate how many witnesses there will be, how much anticipated cross-examination time each of the parties requires for that witness, to lay out a more firm schedule and assess who needs to be available on what days.
Does anyone else have any more questions for either Joe or Steph or anyone from the state? Okay, we're going to move on now. Thank you so much, Joe and Steph, and everyone who helped you with what you told us tonight. We're going to move on to our first presentation of the evening, which is a technical assistance for Brownfields review of non-radiological site restoration proposal. That's a lot of words. And I'm going to have Susan McMahon from the Wyndham Regional Commission come up and talk to us for a few moments. We were connected to the people from the New Jersey Institute of Technology and subsequently GEI consultants because of the Wyndham Regional Commission and their participation in a Brownfield program. So I thought Susan will sort of explain where all this intersects for us.
So just when Chris came to me that they were just looking for some additional for the non-radiological materials technical assistance, I suggested EPA has technical assistance for their grantees throughout the nation, and in our case, it's New Jersey Institute of Technology, and so we'll be hearing from their consultant in a moment. But just wanted to point out what we're talking about when we're talking about brownfields, and so brownfields. And so when you talk about sites, industrial sites, and I consider the remaining parts of the property an industrial site. Brownfields are land and buildings whose expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. This is a very typical process we've been going through throughout our region. The Wyndham Region Brownfields Reuse Initiative was established in 2000, and we've been helping revitalize former industrial sites and commercial sites and turning them into productive reuse. It's a pretty common thing for property transfer, and altogether our program to assist our towns has brought in over $4 million to the region. And we have assisted with over 54 sites, and 84% of them have been redeveloped or in planning stages for redevelopment. We've also have a revolving loan fund where we've loaned and granted over $1 million for cleanup. Some program highlights, just so you can get a sense of the type of sites we've been talking about. They run the gamut from nonprofit to private. But Red Clover Common was a brownfield site, the one that was redeveloped for Melrose property. Deerfield Valley Transit in Wilmington was a brownfield site. The Brattleboro Farmers Market was a former gas station. Their new parking area, we help with them. So it's different scales, but you know, when you're dealing with an historical area with a lot of different industrial uses, Main Street Art in Saxton's River, Bellows Falls Waypoint Center, we have done a lot of property, so I just wanted to point that out to you. We've also received recognition for some of the work on the national scale for the Algiers Village project, as well as the Commonwealth Dairy project. So it has it has been done. Maybe some of you have never heard of all those sites, but just wanted to point out that we work and it works quickly and it goes through a process working with EPA and Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Susan. We're going to try some fancy new technology this evening, and if all goes well, we're going to have Andrea Poinsett, who is the project professional at GEI Consultants, and Susan Boyle, who is a senior consultant with GEI Consultants, on the screen, and we can see both of them. Elizabeth Limbrick from the New Jersey Institute of Technology have been the people that have teamed up on this effort to help us. And there is a narrative that they have given us, which has been circulated via email to the members of the panel, but we will put it up on the ENDICAP website so that everybody from the public can have access to it. And I think we have around 20 minutes set aside if Andrea and Sue need it. But if you can hear us, I'm hoping you can, or see us or something. Okay, great. So I'll let you take it away.
Okay, so everyone can hear me? This is good?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Good evening. So my name is Andrea Poinsett, and I'm here with Sue Boyle. We work for GEI Consultants, a nationwide environmental consulting and engineering firm. We are part of the New Jersey Institute for Technology Technical Assistance to Brownfield program team for EPA Region 1. The NJIT TAB program is a technical assistance program funded through a cooperative agreement with the EPA, which is intended to serve as an independent resource to communities and nonprofits attempting to clean up and reclaim brownfields. NJIT TAB was contacted by Windham Regional Commission, which has an active brownfields program, as you just heard, for an opinion on non-radiological site restoration and redevelopment considerations under the proposed decommissioning and site restoration scenario proposed at the Vermont Yankee nuclear power station. We were asked to propose questions that the WRC should be asking regarding the future use of the site, as well as questions the WRC might expect to be asked from future redevelopers. And I'd like to make it clear that we were only tasked with looking at non-radiological waste or potential contamination, so anything we deal with is non-radiological. For a little bit of background on myself, I have been with GEI for 5 years and have worked in consulting, environmental consulting, for 9 years, mostly performing site investigations. Sue had a 25+ year career with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and was former assistant commissioner for the site remediation program. She has been with GEI for 9 years and manages a number of projects, including a large utility site remediation, other industrial site remediations, providing regulatory advice, and managing 2 brownfield organizations. We have been part of the NJIT TAB team for EPA Region 1 for about 8 years. So we were asked to review some documents and make some phone calls to discuss the decommissioning plans and site restoration standards as related to only non-radiological and hazardous substances and potential contamination that could be present at Vermont Yankee. We reviewed a site assessment from 2014, a phase 1 from 2017, and a non-radiological hazardous substance cleanup plan dated also in 2017. We reviewed some of the pre-filed testimony as well. And I want to make clear that our opinion is not a thorough evaluation or a critique of those documents for completeness. So typically, there are 5 basic steps to evaluate a property for hazardous substances and waste, and then to move it through to receive either a no further action designation or a cleanup complete designation. The steps are usually a phase 1 environmental site assessment, phase 2 site investigation, a remedial investigation, which is called a corrective action plan in Vermont, remediation and redevelopment. And again, they may be called different things in different states, but the process is all generally the same. The first step of phase 1 environmental site assessment is often completed as due diligence by the prospective purchaser. A phase 1 is completed based on standards put forth by ASTM International based on the EPA all appropriate inquiry. It's essentially a historical review and current site observation. The goal of a phase 1 is to identify recognized environmental conditions, or RECs. There's no intrusive work and no sampling completed during a phase 1, and it does not quantify contamination, but simply identifies areas or materials at a property that may have caused contamination to the environment. It should also be noted that in a phase 1, there are some issues that are not often included, and these include lead paint, asbestos, and mold, all of which could be present at Vermont Yankee and would need to be addressed appropriately during the cleanup. Based on the RECs identified during the phase 1, the next step of phase 2 would be to collect samples to quantify concentrations of potential contamination. In Vermont, the work plan for this investigation is done in consultation with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. If contamination is identified, further remedial investigation would be completed until the extent of contamination is understood. This is also commonly referred to as delineation. This includes vertical and horizontal extents and in all impacted media, so soil, groundwater, surface water, etc. Delineation is not restricted to site boundaries, so any waste or substances that leave the site need to be delineated and remediated as well as ecological impacts and vapor intrusion that could be on or off site. Based on the extent of contamination, a plan for remediation can then be created. There are a number of types of remediation techniques that vary based on contaminants present in what concentration, contaminated media, what standards need to be achieved, and any number of other factors. Our experience is that an accurate financial estimation of potential cleanup costs can be accomplished without cannot be accomplished without a thorough remedial investigation supplemented by engineering and remedial pre-design and actual remedy implementation. Our experience is that financial estimates are updated regularly based on information discovered in the field. Finally, closure of the contaminated site would allow for redevelopment to take place. Remediation and redevelopment are often intertwined in terms of selection of end use, which will determine cleanup standards used or perhaps vice versa. At times, redevelopment plans may serve as a portion of the remedy, such as using a parking lot as a cap for contamination left in place. Redevelopment would be limited based on what remediation standards are achieved. Cleaning up a site to the most stringent standard allows for more options for future site use. However, if some amount of contamination is left in the ground with engineering and institutional controls in place, options for site reuse may be limited. A long-term operation, monitoring, and maintenance plan, an O&M plan of these controls could be necessary and would need to be accessible for future ownership and operation changes. Future site uses can change, but could require additional remediation and/or changes to long-term maintenance of engineering or institutional controls in the future. Excuse me. So through the documentation we have seen, we do not see the standard steps of a typical environmental investigation that I just described. And while we understand the nuclear impacts will be the driver, and we assume they drive the expense of the cleanup, disposal, and storage, we believe that the non-radiological impacts are not being addressed properly. We have seen data that show the site, we have not seen data that show that the site has been adequately characterized and that there's enough background information to accurately evaluate if there's enough money being set aside for non-radiological contamination cleanup. future O&M, and future reopeners or contingencies. These may include changes to cleanup standards, creations of new standards for previously unregulated substances, and future changes to use of the property requiring additional remediation for the protection of human health and the environment. For a property this size, with this much function, and a 50-year industrial history, these investigations are time-consuming and expensive and require the cooperation of property owners, consultants, and regulators to work through the process. In addition, we do not see a plan or a schedule for the standard steps of a typical environmental investigation. So with these details in mind about the process of investigating a non-radiologically contaminated property, we identified some considerations for site restoration and future redevelopment. So we believe the non-radiological assessment investigation record for the site is incomplete. There is not a schedule or a plan to let us know when that is expected to be completed. The analytical data is not adequate to effectively evaluate the property. And inadequate analytical information increases uncertainty in the time and cost estimates for cleanup of non-radiological contamination. As far as standards, we recommend that any sampling be compared to the most recent Vermont standards or an agreed upon site-specific standard based on known concentrations or desired end use of the property as approved by the state. There were new standards released in the July investigation and remediation of contaminated properties rule. There should be a clear statement as to what standards all impacted media, including soil, groundwater, sediment, vapor, surface water, and drinking water, will be compared to and agreed upon by the parties. Standards can change over time based on new information on contaminants or emerging contaminants. Given the length of time anticipated between the remediation and site restoration and redevelopment, consideration of applying future standards and their impacts on this property should be discussed. New requirements for remediation do arise, such as the emphasis on vapor intrusion testing. So it needs to be discussed how will these be factored into the proposed remediation, future remedial requirements if conditions or standards change, and cost estimates, as well as posted financial assurance amounts and contingency funds. Based on our assertion that the non-radiological record is incomplete, we identified the following considerations for redevelopment. Non-contaminated structures below 4 feet are proposed to remain in the ground. The locations of all of the structures remaining in the ground need to be mapped and surveyed. This documentation should be made available to the appropriate parties, updated regularly, and archived for future operators or developers at the property. Structures should be non-contaminated in both radiological and non-radiological sense, and the past use of the structure should be included on the documentation. The frost line should be considered when leaving structures at 4 feet below ground surface, and what implications this could have for future construction or development at the site. If non-radiological contamination at the site is not remediated to the most stringent standards and any amount of non-radiological contamination remain, considerations must be made for long-term monitoring and maintenance of the engineering and institutional controls, including who maintains, inspects, and pays for the monitoring and maintenance, and who is responsible if any repairs are required. In addition, if new substances are added to the list of non-radiological hazardous wastes or substances, if standards change significantly over time, which is often defined as an order of magnitude, the impact of those changes and additions may need to be factored into the ongoing remediation. Questions that would need to be asked are who is going to be responsible for these changes or the additions. So consideration should be made for successive owners of the property that may require the state to meet the most stringent standards for all potentially impacted environmental media. Recycled concrete is proposed to be used at the site. It should be tested for both radiological and non-radiological contamination to be deemed clean for use as fill. And where this fill is used on the site and the analytical information are important for this future site development. Fill locations should be mapped similarly to the remaining structures. With the lack of non-radiological site characterization, it's important to consider future funding that may be needed to clean an area of the site where contamination remains. The site characterization is critical to closely estimating future cleanup costs and contingencies for the site. For redevelopment, developers are going to want to see these documents and the information within that I've previously discussed. Developers are going to want to know that the property they are looking to purchase or redevelop is not contaminated, and they won't be responsibility or have liability for the existing contamination. From our experience working on former industrial sites that have long industrial histories, some with over 100 years, we know redevelopers will want to know what and where everything is that's left in the ground. And this includes structures such as pipe runs, footers, water shutoff valves, foundations, etc., as well as the contamination. And this information needs to be accessible to all interested parties. Surveys and maps need to be regularly updated as either more structures are identified or removed and resolved. It's critical to the redevelopment of a site, especially if structures or contamination will remain in the ground. Now, this list does not contain every consideration or constraint on future redevelopment, but I think it does show that the non-radiological site characterization is critical to future use and redevelopment in Vermont Yankee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Before I open it up to questions for the panel, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. I just want to ask you if GEI Consultants is doing any work on the VY project now, and are you working for the state of Vermont, Entergy, North Star, or any of the partners that are involved in this project?
Hi, I'm Sue Boyle. Not to the best of my knowledge. We did a conflict search before we started. The only thing I had heard that came up between the time we spoke with the NJIT tab and started the project was one of our offices may have received a proposal having to do with groundwater.
Okay, great, thank you. The question was, hey Sue, the question was, do you know who you received the proposal for groundwater from?
You know what, I'm thinking it might have been Entergy, but I could double check that.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you. Does anyone on the panel have any questions for Sue or Andrea? Jack Boyle. And for the purposes for Sue and Andrea, I think what we should do is say our names and why we're on this panel, who we represent.
Hi, Sue and Andrea. My name is Jack Boyle. I'm the Decommissioning Director at Vermont Yankee. First of all, thank you for your assessment and for providing the information to the panel. We appreciate that. I noticed in the documents that you said you reviewed, you reflected back on having looked at Phase 1 characterizations from 2017 and also one from late 2014. I'm familiar with those, and I believe those were supplements to a Phase 1 and Phase 2 site assessment that was conducted in 2001 for the purposes of Entergy purchasing Vermont Yankee. So we didn't repeat any of the information that was in the 2001 assessments, Phase 1 and Phase 2. We were just reflected back in the 2014 and 17. Did you get to review and include the 2001 information in your evaluation?
No, I don't believe we've seen that one.
Right, it was not one of the documents provided to us to the best of our knowledge.
Okay, there's a lot of information in there that would have been good for you to have been privy to as part of your assessment. That's why I asked that question. I've got one other follow-up question. You made comment on the cost for non-radiological remediation potentially not being adequate, or the funds for the estimated cost. Did you review the cost estimate for non-radiological cleanup, including what contingency was assumed by ENVY and the revised cost estimate by North Star?
I don't believe we said it was inadequate. What we said is, based on our experience with preparing cost estimates, we did not see the complete remedial investigation and all the work that part of the process requires. That has been our experience in preparing contingencies. We also had tried to reach out to Entergy and North Star to have a conversation about that, and we were unable to connect with them.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Does anyone else on the panel?
What does not connect mean? Lines down, or they wouldn't take the call?
The offer was made to both Entergy and North Star to connect with the GEI consultants, and North Star said that their written testimony would be adequate, and Entergy, I didn't know either way. So each organization was offered the opportunity to speak to the consultants.
So it means they wouldn't take the call.
Anyone else on the panel? Yes, Lisa.
Actually, so do we know whether Entergy has approached this group to, I mean, she said she thought that they got a proposal from Entergy regarding groundwater. Do you know if you guys have made a proposal to them regarding groundwater?
I will find out about that. In my conversation with the person who received the proposal, our review together, we did not think it was necessarily related to this site and facility, but I can check on that for you.
Okay. I mean, maybe Entergy knows.
I have no knowledge of that, so I do not know.
Could be one of your other plants.
David Andrews from the IBEW. Good evening. You used the phrase most stringent standards early on for the goal for cleanup, and I'm trying to get in my head, and maybe you could speak to this. Does the most stringent standards, does that equate to saying that there is at the end of the remediation that there is no contaminants remaining, or that it's below the existing standards? In other words, how clean is clean?
Do you want to take this? Yeah, how clean is always the question. It would be below the standards, or if above the standards, but the engineering and institutional controls are sufficient. What we meant by most stringent standards, I think actually in reviewing your September meeting, there was some discussion about from the radiological end of things, residential versus commercial and industrial. That's what we were getting at. Again, for the future redevelopment of this site, the most stringent standard would be the one that would give you the most options for redevelopment. We would refer to that as a residential standard or an unrestricted use standard, so you could basically do anything on the property.
I understand, and our state IROC standards do reflect that. The residential standards are the most stringent standard. So it is possible to meet the most stringent standards and still have some contaminants remaining and deeded as such. Thank you.
Yes, Derek.
Hi, it's Derek Jordan. I'm a citizen member. My question is really kind of practical. Can you give us a quick list of substances that you might expect to find or that you would be looking for at the Vermont Yankee site?
Ugh.
Not extensive, just quick.
Well, I'll tell you, when we looked at the phase one, the one substance that surprised us, because I never anticipated seeing this at a nuclear power plant, and you need to understand that I am not a nuclear power plant person, but I was surprised to see dry cleaning fluid and surprised to know that the facility had a dry cleaner. That did surprise us. Underground storage tanks would be expected.
PCBs are another possible contaminant from another number of different places. An oil water separator is mentioned quite often, so there's probably piping associated with that. So any contaminants from any types of the petroleums that may have been used at the facility. So waste oils and volatiles, lubricants, pretty much a lot of different types of contaminants, volatile organic compounds, probably semi-volatiles. I don't know as far as any sort of metals that might have could be present in any of these fluids or petroleums.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Chris?
Kate, if you don't mind, can I ask if Susan has any questions, or as my expert on brownfields? Susan, do you have any questions, or
If you do, come up to the mic. Thanks.
or observations or anything else?
Often, when you look at a phase one, an updated phase one, it notes all the previous studies, and it often attaches if there were phase twos. Did the 2017 phase one that you looked at list all the previous studies?
I don't recall if there was a list offhand. I do know that there was a phase two done in the early 2000s based on the 2001 phase one.
And also if there was, in 2001, the standards have changed, and often when you look at a site, there are new things to look at. So even though there was one done in 2001, you would need to look, because we have already just recently changed some standards in Vermont. And that's really kind of I'm making a statement and also asking you a question. That's kind of your point, that there's reopeners, and that's why when you put down a site, you have to kind of recharacterize it. We learn more as, 16 years later, we've learned a lot. Would you?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It is 16 years old, which sometimes doesn't seem that old, or from another perspective could, and it's still been in operation. So the oil water separator was still probably active, and the septic field, and there's drinking potable wells out there that I saw. So, through time and over the years, the things get used, and they need to be updated.
And so there's good base data, but you need to kind of relook at it and see if there's additional problems, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my experience of 16 years in the site remediation program in New Jersey is I've seen new substances come onto the list. I've seen standards change. I never would advise anybody to rely on a 16-year-old phase one in making future decisions for redevelopment. In New Jersey, and I know elsewhere, we're looking at some emerging contaminants. I know Vermont is very much in the forefront on PFOAs, et cetera. Vapor intrusion was not as important back 16 years ago. When I was in the agency, it's much more important now. So those are the types of things we were referencing as needing to be looked at.
Great, thank you. Lisa.
So as someone who's gone through a Brownfields program, thank you very much, Wyndham Regional Commission, here in Brattleboro for trace levels of a contaminant 200 feet down, and went through over $100,000 of testing on a $300,000 property just to clear it. what I learned is that the contamination can exist. The only time you find it is when there is a prospective buyer, and the prospective buyer is the one that is actually looking for the information. So my question is, and other than that, you don't learn because they want to be protected from the liability of having a contaminated site. But what we're talking about here is relying on Entergy to provide us the information about any potential contaminants or any testing that they've done. But how do we really know until there's a prospective buyer what's really out there? I guess that's my question.
And that's a good question, and you're right that you see a lot of this work done because for innocent purchaser developers to acquire property and have liability protection, they're required to do due diligence, which would be a phase 1 and phase 2. And you're right, that's when this type of information is often found. Again, in Vermont, I mean, the question I would throw back to the panel and to your state regulators is, do you have mandatory site remediation for any types of properties? We in New Jersey do with our ISRA program when industrial properties in certain industrial sectors are changing hands. I also know, for example, for the large utility cleanup that I'm overseeing here in New Jersey, there was an effort on the state's part to get a number of utility companies with former MGP sites under memorandums of agreement to initiate cleanup. So again, in your state, do you do that type of requirement for utility sites, large industrial sites, what we would call categorical cleanups?
Can anybody answer that from the state?
This is Peter Walk from the Agency of Natural Resources. I think I better take that question back to my staff and come back next month with an answer, because I would not want to answer that incorrectly.
And my point in raising it is that would be a time when the current owner operator would be doing this type of work and having this type of documentation, as opposed to just having a prospective redeveloper come in and do it.
I would say that's a very significant question moving into this whole process, and I would hope that the state would come up with an answer soon. And I would hope also that the state would hold this property to the same level of responsibility that I, as a small business owner, was held to. Thank you.
Great. Yes, Steve.
Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon. I was wondering if you'd be able to provide us a list of the documents that you did review. I looked through the 2 handouts that were emailed to us this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and I don't see really a list of what you did review here. You reference a few things, but nothing specific. Is that something you can provide the panel?
Yes, we can do that.
We can put that together.
And then the other thing I just want to be clear about, you were brought into this this situation by, is it Wyndham Regional Commission, or who did you actually get your marching orders from here?
Yes, they contacted New Jersey Institute of Technology Technical Assistance to Brownfield program. We're a member of their team, and they contacted us to handle the Wyndham Regional Commission's questions.
Very good. So I'm assuming they gave you some sort of instruction in writing as to what they wanted you to do.
Yeah, well, they did, and that's actually, we captured that in the statement that Andrea read. We were asked to look at certain documents, to follow up with phone calls, and the focus was, was there sufficient information to know about proceeding with a cleanup? Was there sufficient information regarding cost estimates? And then what kinds of questions might redevelopers ask? and what kinds of questions should the commission ask. So that's what we attempted to cover in the statement that we just read.
So I guess the other thing, if it's possible, I would certainly like to get a copy of that instruction that you were given that got this project started in your area. Is that possible to share with the panel?
This is Kate. I don't know if is there anything in writing, Chris? We had multiple phone calls, which I was on.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kate,
most of them.
I mean, so you may recall that we had previously asked for some, experts to be able to kind of help us understand what kind of questions we should be asking, including like what questions the panel might be interested in. And so to that end, Susan reached out to EPA and said, hey, what services might be available, and this is available to us because we have a Brownfields program. And at that point, we were introduced to this team, and we brought in Kate as chair of INDICAP, and so we had conversations going over the types of introducing them to the information that was available in the dockets before the Public Utilities Commission, the same information that's available to the general public, and basically just said, what questions should we be asking, what issues should we be aware of, what limitations might there be on development based on what's being proposed in the petition. And I'm happy to share with you, it's not really, there's no really a written request. We had that conversation on a phone call with Kate. And Kate, do you want to talk about your involvement in this?
I think when we talked to both Elizabeth, who's from New Jersey Institute of Technology, and both Sue and Andrea, it was very clear that we're not asking you about your opinion on the sale. We're not asking your opinion on anything that's having to do right now with what's going on, with the docket or at the NRC. We actually never had any discussions with them about that at all. We kept that totally out of it. And it was more, this is because we're not, a lot of us here aren't experts. It's like, take the information that's in the public domain and just review it for us. And, are there people that would be helpful for you to speak with that could help, fill in the information that's in the public domain? And we gave them, I thought they were going to talk, I don't know if you folks ever connected with Bill Irwin, but we had a list of people, and Entergy and North Star were on that list. The town of Vernon, I know they spoke to Bob Spencer. So we tried to make it very like a neutral, unbiased, totally subjective. Here's all the information. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, I was just, for understanding the process and what they're recommending, it would have been helpful for me to see what you actually asked them to do. But if it was that soft, I guess that's what it was.
Yeah.
Because I think in reviewing this and knowing how to actually understand this material, it would certainly have been helpful to me to understand what their marching orders were. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's all I had.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone update? Senator McDonald.
Madam Chair, in the spirit of what type of questions should we be asking, how much is in this fund?
Decommissioning Trust Fund?
No, the fund for the site remediation and future redevelopment. Pardon?
25 million?
25 million. So the question that I'm going to ask is, money has been obligated and it's in a fund to redevelop this site. And we have consultants that are asking us, telling us what the various possibilities are, maybe more contaminated or less contaminated, and we have to worry about the future, et cetera, et cetera. And the goal is to make it available for redevelopment. I have a hard time picturing a redeveloper that is eager to go to this place and buy it. So I asked the following question. Is it outlandish to ask, what if the 25 million, some of it was used to make the site not be dangerous to neighbors, and you put a fence around it? How much, there would be a whole bunch of money left over. And if the local communities thought that that money could be better used developing other things off this site, that would provide more redevelopment, more usefulness, more community benefit, than bringing this, the designated place up to a standard that, other than spending the whole 25 million there, why is it possible, since the money is there, to use it outside the development for a greater benefit to the community? And what would be wrong with asking that question? I would, because I always do analogies. If you won a Harley Davidson in a lottery or a Jersey calf in a lottery, you always have the option of taking the cash and instead of the Harley Davidson, and using it in a way that you think would be a better use. And this panel is only advisory, but is that a reasonable question to ask?
So, the question is, can you use the money designated for the site restoration fund for something other than restoring the site? And I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that, or that's something we'll have to,
Presumably
we can
you
find
would
out.
be obliged to get the various parties to agree, and if you told Entergy we'd settle for 3% less than what was in the fund, and if the community thought that they would get more redevelopment potential from the money, and there was an assurance that with a fence around it and some trees growing in it, and if people didn't go in there to throw their dog the ball in there to go fetch and bring back.
We'll get some smart people looking into it. Maybe we can have an answer.
Well, I mean, can't A&R provide a brief answer to that question? I mean, or the department, or, because I think there are
Wait,
legal obligations
Commissioner
associated with this.
Gentlemen, are we ready? All set down there? June Tierney, Department of Public Service Commissioner. I don't know the precise answer. I'm going to offer you my considered speculation. Happy to check on this. My recollection is that the Site Restoration Fund was created as part of a board order, now Public Utilities Commission. So it would seem to me, Senator, that the first step would be to look at those orders associated with not just the sale of the property to Entergy, but in all likelihood with the licensure of the Vermont Yankee site proper, to see what the precise commitments were that were made in the CPG. And, you know, I think it stands to reason that what the board has given, the PUC can take away. So in all likelihood, that's where the remedy would lie. In other words, it's not impossible, I wouldn't think, but it's also not simple.
Does anybody have? Okay. Yeah, I want us to remember that we have Andrea and Sue, and then I want to get to public questions. So, yeah.
Hey, this is Bill Irwin. Can you hear me?
Hi, Bill. Steve is going to say something.
Just a very brief question and statement. I don't mean to speak for the Vernon Planning Commission, but what I do know is that there's been a lot of effort on the part of the Planning Commission to work towards possibilities for redevelopment of the site. I don't think that I've ever heard anything about putting a fence around it and taking the money and doing something else with it. I would think that the town of Vernon, given that the site is located entirely within the town, would probably have a significant amount of input into that sort of thing. But setting that aside, I think that the site is certainly, I don't see any technical issues with getting that site cleaned up to the point of where it could be used for something else.
Okay, thank, oh. Yeah, and the yeah, and we're going to get an update later from the Vernon Planning and Economic Development Commission. We need to move on to the public because I don't want us to move too far behind. Is Bill there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
If you have a quick one, because I need to move on to get the public in here.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick, and I hope that it's cogent. Specifically, I have the impression from working in state government as well as in private practice in a variety of fields that most non-radiological facilities do everything that was described both by Ms. Poinsett as well as I've heard the Agency of Natural Resources describe it, the characterization of the site before they start to actually consider next steps. And I wanted to ask, is it a unique element of the nuclear power industry that they don't do this? And is that because they have a tendency to follow the NRC guidelines, which allow for site characterization at the end of the safe store period? And I wondered if GEI has had an opportunity, or maybe they could take the opportunity to assess other nuclear power plants and identify whether they can find nuclear power plants that have done a site characterization and all of the other non-radiological cleanup considerations that are typical of other industries, because I think that that would be useful for this panel to understand.
So GEI, as a member of the TAB team, would need to receive that as a work request from the TAB, and Elizabeth Limbrick would have to chime in about how those kinds of work requests come through. We know in the case of the Wyndham Regional Commission, because they have a Brownfields program, they could reach out at EPA's request to the NJIT TAB program.
So this is Elizabeth Limbrick, and yes, that's correct. So we, the request would need to come from either a nonprofit organization or from a government entity to the NJIT TAB program, and then we would evaluate if we have the resources available to be able to move forward with that next request. But one thing I did want to point out is that all of the assistance we provide through this TAB program is provided at no charge to those who receive that assistance. So this assistance was provided at no charge to Wyndham, no charge to NDCAP. And that's because we do have that grant with the federal government to be able to provide this assistance. And we're really glad to have that opportunity to be able to provide this kind of assistance. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Andrea and Sue to answer the question about what other nuclear decommissioning projects you may have looked at.
Well, we did a review based on an internet search to try to get a feel for what other decommissioned nuclear facilities were being used for in the future. We did not check any other, we did not do the kind of effort that the gentleman just asked for, which is basically to look at sites that have been through the process and evaluate if they were, and I think what you were asking us is, could we evaluate if decommissioned plants that have been through decommissioning did go through the same sort of non-radiological process for industries of a comparable size and complexity. Is that what you were requesting?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, we did not do that. It was not something that we were asked to do. And right at the moment, I'm scratching my head a little bit trying to figure out how we would do it, but I'm sure it could be done, but it's not something that we were asked to do, nor did we do it.
It would just be interesting to know what the experience is in the industry of decommissioning nuclear power plants, whether this is unique, what we're seeing with Entergy, that they seem to refuse to want to do a diligent site characterization with drilling holes in the ground and taking significant numbers of samples to not only validate what they describe are the conditions there, but also what they are planning the costs of the decommissioning to be based upon.
I'm going to move on now to the public because we're getting behind, and I want to make sure anyone in the public who wants to ask a question has the opportunity to do so. So is there anybody in the public that would like to ask a question? And when you come up, give us your name and where you're from, even though we know who you are.
I'm Deb Katz with Citizens Awareness Network. So I want to make a sort of comment and I guess give a little history. Since Citizens Awareness Network has been involved in the decommissioning of Yankee Row and Connecticut Yankee. So before 1996, the decommissioning of nuclear reactors was covered by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And because of that, the NRC was in fact worked with the EPA directly through all of decommissioning. So they worked on both radiological and non-radiological issues. With the evisceration of that rule and the NRC basically taking over decommissioning and saying it was no longer major federal action, the EPA was basically left to deal with issues of groundwater contamination. At Yankee Row, because we saw the internal documents at Row and at Connecticut Yankee, the major issues in contamination were PCB contamination, TCE, and lead, as well as asbestos. In fact, Yankee Row, as far as I know, still can't be released for unrestricted use in part because of PCB contamination. The work that was done in terms of the issues of chemical contamination took place after the radiological contamination issues were dealt with. So that is the way the NRC allows it to unfold. They control it, and it was hard for the DEP in Massachusetts to in fact get the information they needed from the corporation, as well as in Connecticut, to get a sense of what was happening in terms of the non-radiological contamination.
Thank you, Deb. Does anyone else in the public have any questions for Andrea or Sue? Yes, sir. Come right up. And we have very little time, so I would ask if you could be as short and sweet.
It's more of a statement than a question, but I think it's worth noting that...
Could you tell us who you are and where you're from for the record?
Bob Leach, Brattleboro, Vermont. But Mr. Noyes with the ANR pretty much reviewed the same documents that Susan and Andrea reviewed and came up with almost the same recommendations for North Star. Excuse me. And in response, North Star has already hired a company called Haley and Aldrich to conduct all the analysis and the samples that the state of Vermont has requested.
Thank you. I think we have one more person.
Hello, John Tuthill from New Hampshire. I had a question about something that Andrea had mentioned, which was about waste substances leaving the site needing to be delineated. And a follow-up to that question would be on whether or not standards have changed, let's say since 2001, for what constitutes non-radiological material and what is handled as radiological waste. In other words, doing your review, were you needing to sort of find that demarcation line between materials that are non-radiological and those that are? are being handled otherwise. So the delineation of these substances leaving the site, does that include reviewing records of what was moved off site and what the destination of that material was?
Actually, when we were talking about off-site delineation, what we were talking about is the definition of a site is not just shaped by the property's boundaries, so that if you have soil contamination or usually groundwater contamination, again, contaminated with non-radiologicals, that's the only thing we're addressing. But if you have that kind of contamination that's emanating from the site onto adjoining properties, that would also need to be delineated and remediated. We weren't talking about, for example, transportation of wastes off the site. We are talking about waste moving, substances or waste moving through the media, leaving the property boundaries and going elsewhere.
Great, thank you. I want to thank you, Andrea and Sue and Elizabeth and everyone at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and GEI Consultants. This has been very helpful, and I know you've put in a lot of time and effort, and we appreciate it very much. And as I said in the beginning, the report, the narrative of everything that you have just said to us will be posted on the State of Vermont ENDCAP website, so everybody will be able to see it. And we will keep you posted, because I know there was a request for possibly answering a couple of more questions, but we will let you know about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Or you can listen in for the rest if you want, but we won't hold it against you if you don't.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
What we're going to do now is let's see if we can get back here at 20 of. We're a little bit behind schedule, so we want to keep rolling because we have the intervenors in the docket coming up next. So at 20 of 8, we'll be back. Okay. All right, everybody, we're going to start back up. And next up is we have 4 intervenors in the certificate of public good for the license transfer. And tonight we have, Chris Campney is on our panel, and the Wyndham Regional Commission is an intervenor. We have Bob Spencer, who's representing the Vernon Planning and Economic Development Commission. We have Clay Turnbull from New England Coalition, and we have Rich Holshoe from the Elnu Abnaki tribe. And each of them is going to take about 3 minutes right now just to tell you in a nutshell why they're involved in the docket. And then we're going to just open it up for questions from the panel and then open it up for questions from the public. We decided to put this on the agenda because we realized we've spent a lot of time hearing from the state of Vermont, Entergy, and North Star, but we haven't taken the opportunity to actually have a conversation or listen from other individuals and organizations who are involved in the case before the PUC. So I guess, I don't know who wants to go first. I don't know if you want to go Rich, Clay, and Bob. Go for it, Rich.
I'll go first. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, panel. Kwai Nidumba, Ulipayo Payan, Niboi Wi Pam Gisagak, Indilawizi Litz Taindai Wantastagak, Utisokakik. My name is Rich, and I'm from Wantastagak, Brattleboro. I represent the Elnu Abenaki tribe. We filed for intervenor status, and we're granted that. We also are standing in for 2 other Vermont tribes, Nulhegan and Coasek. Missisquoi Abenaki filed for intervenor status separately and will be representing themselves if they choose to. We come to you as people, very simply, not technicians, not regulators, just people. I'd like to read to you a very short statement that I shared with Scott State when we met with him a month ago. Our concerns are irrespective of the site's owners or managers. They derive from the land itself. As Indigenous people, we consider ourselves one with the landscape. with the continuing presence of ancestors, the promise of those yet to come, and all of its other resident entities, human and other than human. We see this place through our own eyes, outside of the concepts of time and separation, and the validity of this perspective has been recognized and protected under a variety of legal mechanisms. We enter this dialogue in good faith, reserving our rights and conducting ourselves as sovereign Indigenous people. So we come to you, in that respect, we also come to you just as human beings. This is a dialogue, this is a conversation, this is not a confrontation, conversation. We filed testimony, it's available on the Public Utility Commission's e-file site under Docket 8880, and you can read it there if you'd like. I'm not going to go over all that right now. Very briefly, and I shared this with Scott State of North Star a month ago and his council. I will be sharing this by invitation of the Vernon Planning Commission. I'll be speaking with them next month. I share this information freely and widely, and it's no secret. Some people might say, well, it is a secret. Where were the Indians in 1970? Why didn't they stand up then? And I would simply say to you that if you know the history of the Abenaki people in the state of Vermont, and I'd be happy to explain that to you, you would understand better. This state only began, by and large, to recognize its own Indigenous people about 20 years ago. We're looking at 12,000 years of history. So that's the basics. Our simple concerns are that there are laws on the books, all indicators, historic, our own cultural traditions, and scientific predicators would indicate that our concerns are valid and there are significant cultural resources likely on the site. I can't prove it. No study was ever done. There have been partial studies in the past. And all we're asking is that going forward, what's done is done. Can't change that. But going forward, due diligence should be taken. There should be oversight. There should be consultation with the Native people. And things should be done in a circumspect manner. Scott State has already agreed to this. That report has been published in the media. I think our concerns are reasonable, and we'd like them to be paid attention to. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Rich. Clay. And Clay has provided us with paper copies of what he's putting up on the screen.
Yeah, there's a Hi, my name is Clay Turnbull. I'm with New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution. Thank you for having us tonight. Next slide. I'm going to say next slide pretty quickly, probably. We approach this intervention from a perspective of how could the proposal be improved. Next. We're concerned not only with the timing of decommissioning, but with the quality of the decommissioning. And from this point forward, we could strive to return the land to as good as it was before, or we could leave it as an orphaned industrial site with the residual radiation higher than necessary. Next. Vermont Yankee should follow the examples of Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, and Yankee Row in Massachusetts and adopt standards for site residual radiation of 10 millirem, all pathways, and 4 millirem for water. Next. Think of it as the New England standard or the 10-4 standard. Next. The current proposal for Vermont Yankee is 1.5 times dirtier than the levels at other New England decommissioned reactor sites. Vermonters deserve a site which is at least as clean as other New England sites. Next. After site restoration has been completed, the site should be maintained as a nature preserve with no industrial, commercial, or residential use. I know that sounds brutal. It is important. That's next. It's important to remember that mostly because of isphacy, the spent fuel on-site security considerations, no decommissioned commercial reactor has been repurposed for industrial or commercial use. There's none. Next. It's important to remember, while in both Maine Yankee and Connecticut Yankee, both of those sites have nature preserves and open land. Next. This is just a quick shot of Maine Yankee next and Connecticut Yankee post-decommissioning next. North Star should be required to have a performance bond of at least $200 million to guarantee complete radiological and non-radiological decommissioning. Next. If North Star can't come up with that, doesn't have the collateral to support that, then they likely don't have the assets to support raising money if they have any large surprises. Next. And surprise costs can and do occur at nuclear decommissionings. Connecticut Yankee was well into decommissioning when massive contamination was found. That added $400 million. And similar at Maine Yankee, they were well into decommissioning when they found deep pockets of contamination. Next. There is a prohibition against using rubblization at the site, and that must be enforced. Next. The site is a Native American cultural site with profound ceremonial and ancestral implications. The alkaline chemical reaction of concrete with acid rainwater, groundwater, and wet soil is greatly enhanced by rubblization, and there will inevitably be negative radiological implications. If over 1 million cubic feet of demolition debris is going to be buried on site, North Star should be required to obtain a permit governing solid waste disposal. Next. And I did a quick Google search on Greenfield and came up with this in the next 2 slides. And the next. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clay. We have Bob Spencer.
Okay, thank you. I guess I need this. There you go. Thanks, Clay. Okay, there we go. My main point tonight is to try to clarify and amend the Town of Vernon's Planning Commission's testimony to PUC. We met last night in a special meeting, which was intended to update our town plan, which we're working on, but we also addressed our testimony. And basically, there's been confusion about the terminology, and that's reflected in the minutes from our last meeting about unrestricted use, residential use, greenfield. And so we're all a little bit confused about what that means. Our testimony used the term unrestricted residential. We said specifically, and this was our number one comment, site should be remediated as to all contaminants, not just radioactive, to support use of the property without limitation, i.e. unrestricted residential, per all relevant and appropriate Vermont site restoration standards. If any portion of the site is to be remediated to allow for some other level of end use, such as commercial or industrial, the town would request that it have meaningful input on what areas of the site might be best suited for which uses, and to ensure consistency with its town plan. What we will be doing to our filing through our attorney is amending that language. I'm not quite sure how that happens, but we did meet with him last night, Dave Carpenter. But we also want to insert into that the language from our 2014 town plan, which states as a recommendation, the town should pursue discussions with representatives of Entergy VY regarding possible reuse of the power plant site for commercial and industrial development following decommissioning. So the intent of the town plan is to explore the reuse of that site. Furthermore, we have a future land use plan map, and it's in the back end of the plan, which shows the VY site as industrial, an eye and a color pattern for 2 other sites as industrial. We don't believe that there is any expectation of residential use of the site, so we wanted to clarify that we're not proposing any residential use of the site. But that term is what's used in the Vermont cleanup standards. In the tables at the end of that, it says EPA residential, EPA industrial. And so I think that's why there's been some confusion. We also have been working hard to evaluate the concept of rubblization and the cleanup standards. And in that effort, as part of our pre-filed testimony, we had a report prepared by Bob Leach, who spoke earlier as a citizen of Brattleboro, but also he is representing the town of Vernon as our technical consultant. And a copy of his report is on the desk of each of our panelists here and is available. And that report concluded that rubblization is safe and actually has some environmental advantages to the town compared to trucking off all that material and then trucking in replacement material, provided it is clean and meets the standards. We also, as a town, are working to develop a new updated town plan with help from Wyndham Regional Commission, who we contracted with, to look at redevelopment of that site. So we're under the assumption that the site can be reused for something that will generate tax base and jobs. I'm hearing that maybe it can never be used for some reasons, but we want to explore that fully before we write it off. And tax base and job creation and all the jobs that come with it, if we could find a redeveloper, are so important to a little town like Vernon. I also want to point out that we, thanks to some help, a lot of work with Martin Langeveld, who's on our planning commission, received a designation of an area of town as a village center. And that village center area actually includes property owned by Entergy and abuts the VY property. So we have some, we want to get some more work to look at a master plan for that area. We're kind of following on the heels of Algiers, the town of Guilford, who really revitalized their village center. Not as many complications as a nuclear power plant, but you know, that's been a great success story. We have formed a Friends of Village, Vernon Village, not-for-profit, to pursue purchase of land and planning money. So I just wanted to communicate that we are still committed to finding productive reuses of the site. And if you look closely at our pre-filed testimony, we did talk about preserving artifacts on the site. We talked about public recreational access to the river. We're not thinking of just industrial use. We're thinking of a multiple land use that could incorporate education with the school, children, riverfront access for recreation, and acknowledging the historic significance of the site, not only as a nuclear power plant, but also as a Native American site. And that's why we invited Rich to our next meeting. I'm also, in fact, I think it's great we're sitting at the same table. Well, let's do it again. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add?
Yes, I'll be brief. We've, Wyndham Regional Commission in past dockets had always advocated for prompt decommissioning whenever the plant would eventually shut down for a number of reasons. One, do it while the plant owners were well, using a decommissioning trust, but also try to seek financial guarantees of the current owners of the plant, as opposed to waiting to the end of a safe store period when you didn't necessarily know how the decommissioning trust fund and all might ultimately perform. But the other big reason we were pushing for that was to try to retain the legacy employees as long as possible, to have a less sharp employment drop-off. That ship has sailed, but we're still encouraged when the announcement came out that the plant might be more promptly decommissioned, because the known knowns are better than the unknown unknowns. But the main questions that we're looking at in the docket, and we didn't file any testimony, we did file discovery, but we're looking at the implications of the proposed site restoration standards for redevelopment of the site, the basis for decommissioning and site restoration cost assumptions, including the completeness and of the site characterizations, the financial capacity of North Star to complete decommissioning and site restoration, and related financial guarantees. And then what are the implications if the funds are expended and decommissioning and site restoration are not complete because things were found, conditions were found that may not have been expected? Would that mean it would go back to safe store, and if so, for how long, and what would that mean for the rebuilding of the decommissioning trust? But those are the basic questions that we're looking at. We'll be asking questions during the technical hearings and filing briefs at the conclusion, but right now we just want to see what the different parties file, what evidence is presented at the technical hearing, and then we'll arrive at our conclusions. And it is very important to us to know what Vernon wants to ultimately do with the site, recognizing that, you know, all of us may be looking a very long ways down the road about how that site is eventually used. Some of the Brownfields sites that you heard Susan talking about today were developed for industrial purposes, you know, well over 100 years ago. And so we could be talking about future generations' use of the site. You know, right now we're talking about, well, there may not be an immediate use while there's spent nuclear fuel on the site, but ultimately the decisions that are going to be made in this docket are going to determine how any future generation uses that site, even if it's 5, 10 generations down the road. So that, when we talk about site restoration standards, I think it's fair to say that the commission, that's the perspective that we're taking, is looking at the ultimate reuse of the site, not just for this generation, but for several down the road.
Great. Thank you all. Now I want to open up for questions or comments from the panel. And I don't know how many people have a question, but I would ask if you have one question or like two quick ones, so that I just want to make sure there are a lot of us get to ask questions because we don't have a lot of time. So, David Andrews.
I'll try to be brief. At the last meeting, there was reading the minutes and going over the meeting. It looked like there was a lot of confusion about restricted versus unrestricted, and we hear it being bantied about. So I went to the regulations, 10 CFR 2014-03 criteria for license termination under restricted conditions, and 1402 for unrestricted. Unrestricted talks about 25 millirem per year, and then it's greater than for restricted. And the key is it talks about 25 millirem per year to the critical group. And we haven't heard that phrase before, the critical group. 10 CFR 2010-03 defines critical group, means the group of individuals reasonably expected to receive the greatest exposure to residual radioactivity for any applicable set of circumstances. So what I'm kind of confused by here is, and this question, Clay, is addressed to you. We're talking about looking to have it be maintained as a nature preserve, in which most people would not be there, but a person who shows up is in fact a critical group. And the position here is looking to have a 10 millirem versus 15 millirem, so we're talking about 5 millirem per year difference. If it's not residential, if it's a reserve and there's nobody there, how did you square that with no industrial, no commercial, no residential use, but then using the a 10 millirem criteria for critical groups?
I think we're looking at it from the perspective that it could be cleaner than is required, rather than what the regulations allow. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine all chose 10-4 willingly. They said, this is doable, let's do it.
And why not shoot for 0?
I can't tell you that.
Okay. Second question, if I may. is to Rich. And I'm trying to get my head around this, and I'm hoping you can help me here. Is the issue that you're presenting here, is it specific to the Vermont Yankee property? The understanding I had from you from past presentations was this entire area, Windham County, going across the river to Hinsdale and all, has equal significance. So I guess that's the first quick question is there something specific about the Vermont Yankee property, or is it the fact that this is happening now at that site and that's what makes that significant?
That's a very good point that you raise. It is true that the whole area along the river are traditional homelands, yes. Why Vermont Yankee? When regulatory proceedings such as this come up, there are rules that kick in, typically federal, but also state. And this being that opportunity, and the fact that those rules were not followed in the past, omitted for some reason, I'm speaking up now. Why Vermont Yankee in particular?
Yes.
That is covered in my testimony. Briefly, I could run down the list. At Cooper's Point, Great Bend, where the Vernon Dam and the nuclear power plant is situated, was a fishing ground, ancient fishing ground, now underwater, and the fish are gone because of the dams. David Dean knows about this. Right across the river, directly across the river in Hinsdale, and we see the river as a unifying characteristic, not a division, not a divider between two states. Mm-hmm. That's a political construct. Directly across the river is a very, very well-known Abenaki, Sokoke historical site where many, many, many people died in one particular incident. Those people that were at that site were from that whole area. It's the historical record is clear. There are burials north, south, east, and west in the historical record of Vermont Yankee. Guaranteed they're on the site. Where? We don't know. That's why I'm just asking for diligence going forward. And Scott State has agreed in principle that he will hire a cultural consultant and we will devise a plan going forward to approach this differently.
Understood. I looked up using the new EPUB or EPUC. What's the state website?
EPUC.
EPUC? EPUC, okay, yeah. The EPUC. Spent a couple hours searching through it, and I found a whole collection of documents that indicated that, and of course agencies change over the years, but State of Vermont Agency of Development and Community Affairs and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and some others have been involved apparently as part of Act 248 and or Act 250 and have required historic cultural resource investigations. And I found 6 instances of historic investigations that have happened at the Vermont Yankee site going back to 1972 and as recently as 2009. So a question here to the state is it safe to presume that those same requirements that were in the past for the cultural historical resource investigations will be required as well as part of this docket?
That would probably best be answered by Commissioner Buckley,
Yes.
who has just stepped out. Commissioner Buckley is charged with purview over the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, on which I serve. I am not here in that capacity. I'm here directly representing the tribes.
Right.
And the Department of Historic Preservation, which Commissioner Buckley oversees, did just file comments to which you refer. There have been, and until she gets back, I'll fill in. There have been partial cultural resource surveys required and completed in the past.
Correct.
At the site.
Yep.
They were partial.
Mm-hmm.
They were primarily dismissive in that they say that most of the site was disturbed previously and so there's nothing to look at here. We actually don't know, by North Star's own admission, what was disturbed and what wasn't. So to say that it was disturbed and you don't need to look at it is completely inconclusive. Going forward, we'd like to have a baseline survey as to what was disturbed, what wasn't disturbed, and how are you going to handle those areas.
And we can ask Katie when she comes back to ask.
Thank you.
Is that good?
Thank you.
Right, is panel that has any questions for any of our panelists? No. All right. We want to open up to the public. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Separate parties.
I just wanted to know if they were all parties to the proceeding. They are.
Does anyone in the public have any questions that they'd like to ask anybody on any of our panelists? Oh, here comes Katie, or worse. Not that all the attention is on you, Katie, but.
David, do you want to pose the question? We're going to pose the question. Okay. My apologies.
I'm sorry, I should have made sure you were here before I asked.
Okay.
Thank you. The question, as part of the discussion with Rich, is that there have been a number of archaeological or cultural investigations as various buildings were constructed or the low-level waste pad was researched at Vermont Yankee. And they were done with involvement from the state. And the question is, with the current docket, are those planned? Can you speak to what kind of involvement the state is going to have on that?
I didn't hear the last part of what you said. You were a little quiet on the mic.
What kind of involvement the state is going to have?
Moving forward?
In specific regards to Docket 88.
I believe that the State Historic Preservation Officer entered a public comment in response to that on the record. Is that what you're asking in reference to? I'm not sure of your question then.
Yeah, no, that was a question.
When the PSB was built, when the new parking lot was built, when the receiving building was built, when the low-level waste pad was researched, one of the steps that was required as far as the state process with the docket was that there be a study done, including digs were appropriate, to confirm that there's no archaeological impact to the area that's planned to be disturbed. That has been documented. That's out there. The question is that same process going to be followed with Docket 8800?
I would have the State Historic Preservation Officer answer that question instead of me. That should be posed to her.
Okay. With sensitivity to the fact that what's different this time is that we have an intervener here who obviously has concerns that weren't present in the past. We're raising. Tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, Rich. We're raising a level of consciousness here.
You raise it. Go ahead. It's awesome. There have been surveys done in the past. They were partial. And going forward, whether the state, through the Department of Historic Preservation, chooses to participate is up to them. We would have no objection to that. What is slightly different this time is that we are representing ourselves, and these past studies have not involved any consultation with Native people. This time we are requesting that, and Mr. State is responding positively, for which we are
Mr. State
grateful.
is responding in the affirmative on behalf of North Star.
On behalf of North Star.
Have you gotten that same response from the state?
Well, the state did file comments, as Commissioner Buckley indicated. Council Dale Azaria, on behalf of Laura Treixman, did file those comments a couple weeks ago. And we concur with those. Whether they choose to take that further is up to them, or up to the, who am I talking to here? The commission.
The PUC.
Yeah, right.
Dave, just to elaborate a little on that, I think part of your question is, will that same analysis be undertaken in this case as has been undertaken in past cases? Yes, and so the criterion that's in section 248 for archaeological matters pertains in this case as well. So the PUC will be making a finding on that.
Could you speak up? You're whispering into the mic and I can't hear you.
Well, in that case, I wouldn't want you to go home unsatisfied, because bad things happen to me when you're mad at me. So I will project my voice.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, given that this is a Section 248 proceeding, the archaeological standard in Section 248 will be applied by the PUC. And I think it's just wonderful that we have your involvement, Rich, because I agree with you, Dave. This is new to me, at least, and I've been doing these proceedings for any number of years. It's important to hear your voice. I said as much, I think, early on back when you were thinking about intervening. So the question really becomes, what record does the PUC have upon which to make its findings? It will, at a minimum, have Rich's testimony. It will also have the comments that were filed by, is it Historic Preservation? Claire, do you know? Well, that's fine. That's fine. I think we'll leave it at comments have been filed. I'm not sure whether they are of an evidentiary nature or not, but I'm quite sure that the PUC will have sufficient evidence. Can you hear me, Representative Dean? Because I want to make sure you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Excellent.
One of the things that I'm a bit confused about is that whenever federal dollars are used or the federal government takes an action and there is a chance of historic impact, there is a required Section 106 review. I bump into it all the time when we take down dams. I've got to get a consultant in that's got a lot of work, a fair amount of expense. This is a federal action. Not what we're talking about here for the state, but it is a federal action in terms of decommissioning. And it's an action on the license. I would fully expect the feds to require historic review and then an MOU to be worked out with the State Historic Preservation Office.
Well, happily, I am not in a position to speak to that. I can only speak to the state proceeding.
Right.
And so, again, Section 248 has a standard in it.
I'm just sort of putting it out to the universe in terms of the discussion with the other members of NDCAP. And a 106 review requires at least one public hearing. So, and at some point down the road, I suspect we're going to hear about what the feds are going to be looking for.
I mean, and building on that, I mean, I think, and maybe Joe can speak to this, but I think that the NRC, for the purposes of the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, rely on a generic environmental impact statement. I don't remember, I'm trying to think back to what I read in the one prepared for VY, to what extent they get into this at all. I don't think there's anything there, but so that's been that was one of our comments on the PSDAR, is this reliance of and it's not a complaint to Entergy, it's a complaint to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about relying on generic environmental impact statements satisfying their NEPA requirements. And so that may be something else that this panel may want to, as we're sitting here, I assume that the NRC is going to continue its decommissioning regulation promulgation. So that may be something that we want to consider recommending, is not relying on generic EISs. But, and I know just enough about this to be dangerous, but.
Yeah, to add to that, a few years ago, helping win the regional with a project, helping one of our towns, something a little less complicated than this, replacing a culvert. And I made the case, with a remarkable lack of success, that we didn't need to do such a survey because we were pulling up gravel that had been placed, pulling out a culvert, putting in a new one, and putting gravel back. And because federal funds were involved, and it was through a state agency, not feds, they said, no, you cannot assume that. You must do a survey, and so we hired consultants to look at that. And I now realize they were right. So I hope we would support that.
Oh, yeah, Lissa.
This question's for Bob Spencer. So I understand that the size of the property that would be available for redevelopment is approximately 100 acres, right? But I'm wondering if you've had any feedback from the NRC regarding how large a boundary needs to be maintained around the canisters, the dry casks.
No, we have had nothing on that. And that's a big, valid question.
So we don't really know how large the site will be for redevelopment.
No.
Potentially. And have you done any studies, or are you aware of any other redevelopment that's taken place alongside spent fuel canisters? Like at other decommissioned plants? I know there's not a lot of them.
We have not evaluated what other sites have done.
Okay. So a lot of your analysis is really centered around redevelopment after the casks are gone, or while they're still there?
It's been our hope that the redevelopment, there would be sections that would be eligible and released by NRC for redevelopment, even with the casks there.
And
But that's a very good question. We don't know what the setbacks would be, the security protocols, but reducing, and this is more of an Entergy North Star question, reducing the footprint significantly in our minds means that there's areas that will be released. North Star has said that they would hope parts of the site could be released. They have no intention of developing it themselves, so they say.
Right.
And we did have strong interest from a development team 2 years ago to develop a natural gas-fired power plant there, and they felt it was consistent, a consistent reuse of the site.
So are there any indications about when an NRC might issue this edict to you for you to know how?
I'd have to defer to Entergy. We don't correspond with NRC.
Any insight from you guys?
I mean, I think it's are we like tilting at windmills here? Is this just totally not possible? You know, we've been led to believe it is possible.
Yeah, I believe it's possible too, from all the discussion that we've had here, and when the NRC was here a few meetings ago, I think it was definitely feasible in discussing that with them. Just a couple of comments on the landmass that we have and then where the site boundaries are. We've got, I think it's about 120 acres total in the site property. If you look at the site boundary fence that we have that's in play right now, that encompasses around 14 to 15 acres. If you look at, after we get all the fuel loaded onto the pads, we're going to bring in the security boundary to where it's only going to be on the order of 1.5 acres that's encompassed in there. But I don't expect that the site boundary fence that encompasses about 14 to 15 acres, that's still going to be the minimum. There would be no development, you know, inside that ring, if you will. What I don't know is what would the standoffs be from that site boundary fence. And I don't know when we'll have that information. I think it has to come between discussions between the NRC and Entergy/North Star.
And are you aware of any redevelopment that has already occurred at decommissioned plants that still have dry cask storage on site?
I'm not aware of any, and I saw in one of the slide presentations that they stated that there has been none. I think it might have been NEC's presentation. And I'm not aware of any, but I'm not sure.
Well, one of the points of our municipal planning grant that we're working on right now with the state funding and is to look at the potential reuse of the site. So we will be getting into this in the next few months. Our goal is to have that plan done in March, meeting a May deadline So we're actively working on it.
Great, I think we all need that information. Thank you.
Right, yes.
So, Bob, if you guys go back and look, back in 2012, when we did the resilience plan for Vernon, looking then at what would happen if Vermont Yankee closed, things for you guys to think about. When I spoke with and I can't remember the guy's name now, but there's a footnote that notes the phone call that I had with, he was with the NRC and he oversaw or was involved with the decommissionings at Yankee Row, Maine Yankee, and Connecticut Yankee. He said at the time that because of the relatively small size of the site, that it would be, his assumption was it would be unusable until the spent fuel was gone. So if you look at that plan, it cites that and notes that conversation and has his name. Now, like you and others, when I've asked that question to NRC, other NRC people, it's almost like they disavow his existence. But it would seem like there would be, and it sounds like Entergy's, like you guys are on the path to kind of get that answer. What is the setback from that fence? Because I would imagine too that we could look to Connecticut Yankee, Row Yankee, and Maine Yankee and see what the setbacks are from their, what's their defensible perimeter, or whatever the technical terms would be, from their fence lines around their SFCs to give some idea. But it sounds like Entergy's going to have an answer here at some point about how close is too close and what's going to be redevelopable or not. But that's just, I'm not making a point one way or another, but that's the reason for the lack of certainty is there's been about as many answers as people asked, which kind of, again, makes you scratch your head about the NRC, about what standards they're using and are they rolling. And if they are, maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. But it sure would be good for host communities to have some predictability if you could say, what is your standard, once that site is cleared and it's just spent fuel remaining, because you would, and maybe they do have, maybe the standards are clearer than what I understand. It seems like it wouldn't be that complicated a question, but maybe it necessarily is, and it's in the interest of everybody involved that it be that complicated, but it just seems like it's odd that it's that hard to pin down. And again, I'm not blaming anybody other than just the kind of opaqueness of the NRC to mere mortals.
It might be helpful to understand that NRC doesn't have prescriptive security protocols that the licensee has to follow. The licensee puts together a security plan and runs that past NRC. NRC ferrets out whether it's a good plan or not. But NRC doesn't have, there's no fixed rule that says you have to have this many feet, you need to have that many of those or that many of those. So it is amorphous.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is one of these conversations I will probably have again on another meeting because it's obviously of interest to many people. So I want to thank Bob and Clay and Rich. It was very helpful. And again, we'll probably hear from, I already asked the question and nobody took me up on it. So I'm sure we'll be talking to you folks again as well. So thank you so much. And I hope you come to all of our next meetings. And I hope, Clay, go to a Vernon Planning Commission meeting. Now we want to talk about moving forward in 2017 and 2018. We do have a meeting scheduled for November 16th. At this time, we do not plan to meet in I was going to say, we don't plan to meet in 2018. That's like wishful thinking, but we don't plan to meet in December. And I want to, before I throw it over to David Andrews to talk about what we're talking about in November, I want to throw it over to Lissa because she had something she wanted to raise meeting topic-wise.
Thank you, Kate. I just wanted to bring to the attention of the panel that the panel has taken a position on centralized interim storage. And I'm pretty sure that most people on the panel aren't aware that the panel has taken this position, but it occurred in a letter November 27th, 2015, when Endicap joined with 4 other communities in calling for there to be centralized interim storage, which essentially means that one day all the casks will be moved somehow by rail out to somewhere that we don't know where it will be yet, to have a centralized facility rather than what the federal law now dictates would be a centralized geologic storage facility. So in other words, you need a change in the law, the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, to allow for centralized interim storage. And as most of us probably know, that centralized interim storage would happen at Waste Control Specialists. They've been filed a petition with the NRC to actually be that. They have close ties to Energy Secretary Perry, and from all accounts, they're trying to move this legislation very quickly through the Congress. And I was just concerned because I've been coming to these Endicap meetings for a long time, and I don't remember there ever being a discussion about the merits of centralized interim storage versus long-term geologic storage, or for on-site storage, as a matter of fact. So I just wanted to put it out there because currently the panel has taken a position on what is a fairly controversial issue that requires a change in federal law, and I think that we should discuss what that means. And I think that, it's really, most people just say, oh, we want the stuff to be gone as soon as possible. But what that actually means, there's a lot of devil in the details. It means that we have to have that centralized interim storage facility ready and approved. That's going to take many years. We have to have the rail lines all ready to go, and it could be 10, 15 years before most experts think that could even happen if there was a centralized interim storage. And I've just done a lot of research, and I'm worried about that concept, and I think it merits further investigation by the group. Our federal delegation seems to back the concept. Congressman Welch is on a bill that would allow that to occur. But to me, it seems like, why would you want to move the stuff all the way across the country just to have to maybe move it again? We're talking billions and billions of dollars of development for something that, like Yucca Mountain, where $46 billion was spent and it's not even operational. Are we really making the right decisions? So I would ask that the Advisory Council, maybe in the November meeting, take a look at some of the documents I'm going to submit about centralized interim storage. Hundreds of groups around the country actually advocate for hardened on-site storage. And while you might say, geez, we want to get rid of it as soon as possible, if you look at if Vernon was to potentially safeguard the material on site till there was a geologic repository, it could mean millions and millions of federal dollars coming to Vernon because they're doing that job. So I'd like to see this put on the agenda for November potentially as issues to be discussed, because it is in play in terms of the federal, the Congress looking at this issue. And I'd like to hear from our federal delegation, who I understand are coming in November, to understand why or why not they've taken a stand or not taken a stand on this issue. And I think it might be in everybody's interest to learn more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lissa. And I want to throw it over to David Andrews, because we had an Issues Committee meeting where we were talking about what we thought we should address in November and some of the issues going into 2018. One of the things we were going to talk about in November is getting brainstorming with the rest of the panel about other issues we should talk about in 2018. But if you want to just run down what we were thinking the November agenda would look like, and so we can all talk about what we want to talk about.
Thank you. So one thing that we had discussed at the onset was we were looking at having a November meeting, but we weren't planning on a December meeting. The December meetings haven't been too much fun in the past. So one item is an update on any planned events. This is between the state of Vermont, Entergy, and North Star. Any planned events that will be going on between the time frame of the November and the January meeting, because we have a 2-month period there, so kind of a look ahead to see if, what's going to be happening, if there's anything noteworthy going We're going to be have a discussion with input from the representatives we have from Massachusetts and New Hampshire on specifically what concerns those states have going forward. That's an effort that we have to try to more proactively involve our New Hampshire and our Massachusetts friends in this process. One question came up. The question is, how much actual space, we've discussed this evening as well, how much actual space is going to be available to be redeveloped on the site once DSVISI is complete and the new perimeters are established? In speaking specifically to addressing that framed within the residential standards. And that's something that we're tasking Mr. Lashinsky on. See his ears perk up there. We'll get with you on it to explain that further. We're looking to have Stephanie Hoffman, with June Attorney's permission, to speak to the Dean Wynn testimony regarding the residential standards. That was requested by Mr. Dean, our Mr. Dean, not the other Mr. Dean. We're looking for a brief update from our state engineer, Mr. Lashinsky, on the rail infrastructure and the potential movement timetables, as best as you know from the meetings that you've been attending. We're going to block out a pretty good chunk of time so we can have a roundtable discussion amongst the panelists as far as what topics, what issues, what concerns we have based on our past meetings here that we want to explore in 2018. This is an advisory committee. We tend to run in a direction, and it's time to take a pause and look back and see, are we going in the direction we want to, what things we want to discuss, what issues do we have coming up. In that also, is why we want to put a big chunk of time here. That also applies to the public. We're looking for input for the public as far as what are the issues that you're looking to have this panel working on. And we also have to get started. We run short on this each year. The 2017 annual report is going to be due soon. We want to try to have it in the legislature's hands when they start. The sooner the better. We know that our January meeting is going to be on January 25th. Location to be determined, Kate? To be determined.
We'll know by November, hopefully.
Yep. And we already know in 2018, one thing we want to do is to request Holtec to come to speak to us on their timetable on the interim storage facility that they're planning for New Mexico. WCS had been planning one for Texas, and they suspended their application. But Holtec is planning one for New Mexico, so we want to see if we can get them to come and speak to us on that. Madam Chair.
Yeah, Chris?
Steph or anybody else, sorry, Steph. What's the technical hearing schedule potentially?
I just wanted to raise that this meeting would fall right, the January meeting would fall right in the middle of technical hearings as currently scheduled. So the last 2 weeks of January have been reserved for technical hearings.
Do we want to consider moving it?
So I'll throw this out there, and it may be a really bad idea. But what if, unless there's a specific topic we want to cover in January, did you say there was a specific topic for January yet?
No.
What if the INDICAP meeting was actually kind of held in conjunction with the PUC hearing on January 4th, that the INDICAP was here to hear what people had to say during the hearing? Just an idea, I'll just throw that out. Maybe it's a really dumb idea, but, or maybe it's not.
Okay. Oh, here's Commissioner.
There's no such thing as a dumb idea coming from that end of the table. Representative Dean, can you hear me? All right. But that said, you're really talking about involving ourselves with the PUC process, and that's a serious thing. So I think if you want to pursue that, we should probably think about formally contacting the PUC as a panel and suggesting that to them. But why not try?
Well, but I guess what I was thinking too was not necessarily, and again, this may be really dumb, this may be somewhat devoid of the thought process like they talk about on Car Talk, but well, what I was thinking is more of an observation role as opposed to any kind of exchange, just literally observing what people have to say during the hearing.
Well, I would point out, Chris, that it's a public hearing. So
Well, yeah.
certainly the members are within their rights to go to the public hearing. And these hearings are also typically transcribed.
Yep.
So we're able to review that transcript. But to formally seek to conjoin this panel's hearing process with the Public Utility Commission, I don't like to be the party of no, but I don't think I recommend it.
Duly noted.
Those hearings these are the people who take center stage at those hearings, and I think it is a good thing to not complicate a process that first and foremost is intended for them.
Does anyone else have anything?
Do we want to keep our meeting on January 25th, or do we want to push it forward a week?
Does everyone, to do it January 18th, are you suggesting?
Yes.
Does everybody, I don't know if everyone has their 2018 calendars with them, but do we want to all go home and contemplate that? And then I can send an email around to everybody to see if we want to move January meeting to the 18th as opposed to the 25th? Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Yeah, that was Chris's concern, yeah.
I mean, I think it's worthwhile for us to throw out there as we think about it in November what we're doing as a body, that it may be to broaden we've been very focused on the proceeding as of late, but it may be useful for us to think beyond that scope and to think through other ways we might play a role, and in that way not really caring whether the January meeting conflicted with the proceeding or not.
I don't know what the answer is.
I guess
I would just add one thing to that, and that is that the time leading up to those hearings is very intense for the state agencies and also other participants, and I think we may want to think about that. The 18th is literally on the eve of hearings, so I know that council will be working hard. I have to be available to work hard with council. Peter probably has similar concerns in his agency, and the gentlemen who are all sitting there are going to be moving heaven and earth to keep up with these proceedings. So please keep that in mind.
what she said.
Right.
You've been there, Chris, so you know.
Right, so are you suggesting we do it later than the January 25th date? And or we do it on the January 25th date? Or do we need to not worry about this until November meeting, or what should we do? David Andrews is suggesting I send out an email and we talk about it in November. Well, I just want to, I guess I'm asking the state, since you folks are the ones that are going to be the busiest, what works for you folks?
You probably shouldn't ask us that, because the answer is what would work for us is no meeting or after the hearings, and I'm not sure that that really is good for the committee. It may be that there will be a slightly elevated absentee rate during that period, and I apologize, but we really do need to be focusing on the hearing at that point.
Okay, we'll contemplate all of that. I guess the question for November is, do we want to talk about consolidated interim storage? And if we do, to what extent do we want to do it? We're going to have to get people, depending on what we want, we're going to have to get the people here that we're going to need to tell us what we need to know, and whether I can do that in 3 weeks is another issue. Yes, Jack?
Based on the summary that we heard from the subcommittee that David gave us, it sounds like we've got quite a bit for the agenda already on the 16th. And David, one of David's items was, what topics do we want to include in the 2018 agenda? I think we should consider Lisa's topic next month for a future topic, and we can let it weigh in and weigh against other topics at that time.
Does anyone else have any comments? Yes, Steve.
In terms of understanding this issue, I do not remember the vote on that, and maybe it's because my mind is disappearing, but I will go back and review my meeting minutes.
I can tell you what it was.
Oh, go ahead.
It was a letter signed by the chair, which was me, of Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, and Vermont to our congressional delegation.
I see. So it was not a decision by the entire...
Correct.
All right, very good. Now, my mind is perhaps...
You're not crazy there, Steve.
Well, that's a relief, you know, you get my age. But, all right, thank you. I understand now. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yes, please do.
So much of the argument for the North Star sale is contingent upon the expedited reuse and redevelopment of the property. If in fact the presence of the casks precludes development, then that argument is moot. That is why I think it's important that the body understands a little bit about what's being discussed and the issues at play and the timetables at play for removal, if maybe one day it happens, of those casks. Because it's, from my analysis, and I've been looking at this for a few years now, those casks probably aren't going to be moving anytime soon. Unfortunately, in this country, we just are not dealing with our problem of nuclear waste storage. The industry is very eager to release itself from the liability by trying to move casks off, because that's when the federal government becomes liable for whatever might happen with that waste. That's why the industry is pushing, also because, you know, well, they have their own reasons, but for our community and for the cause of redevelopment of the site, it's imperative that we understand what's being discussed at the federal level and what might change tomorrow in terms of the laws. So, you know, I think it's an issue with some urgency, even though one could argue, well, it's been going on 50 years and we still don't have a waste disposal site, so maybe it's not so urgent. But I think we just need to understand what's at play, because it definitely impacts our community.
Does anyone, oh, yeah, Derek.
I agree with Lisa. I think it's an incredibly important topic, and it's something that, as a panel, we should start to wrap our heads around. And if we could just allocate 15 or 20 minutes to an overview of some of the basic concepts and issues around storage of whatever type that's possible, I think it would be beneficial for this panel and for the discussion going forward whenever that happens.
Yeah, David?
Yeah, I think we could probably do just that, Derek. Put in a period of time so we can begin that dialogue, understanding that this is an awful lot more than a one-meeting discussion.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put Tony Lashinsky on the spot, but Tony, are you able to give an overview of this topic? Not now, but would you be in a position to do so for the panel?
Okay, what I would want to do is I would want to consult with some contacts I have at Department of Energy. One thing that we had discussed as a potential November presentation is that now I have been working with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional High-Level Waste Transportation Task Force. And that is that also feeds into what is called the National Transportation Stakeholders Forum.
Oh, I know you. I'm going to cut you off.
Okay.
The bottom line is you could help.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Kate, he's available to help.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, yes, Steve.
Steve Skibnowski. I think it's important, and I'm not sure who would put the information together, but I think it's really important to make sure that people understand, this panel in particular, how this all got started in the first place, because, you know, utilities are responsible for their own waste fuel back when Vermont Yankee came about. And then, of course, things changed in 78 into 1980. And I think it's a very important part of the picture. There was some reference to utilities trying to evade their responsibility, but it's important to remember that utilities did have a plan laid out, and it was essentially halted by the federal government, and the waste was taken over by the federal government. So I think it's important for us to understand that process. I also think it's very important for us to understand what's being done in other countries, and they haven't had any nuclear issues that I'm aware of, but places like Sweden and England, France, I think it's really important that that become part of the topic as well.
Okay, thank you. Does everyone else feel okay? All right. Does anyone in the public have any last parting comments for our October meeting? Peter's hand is sort of going like this. Peter. I thought that there was like 6 or 7 people. Yeah. To talk. Oh no, that's just the sign-in sheet. That's not the get to talk sheet. Yeah, I did have something to say. Oh wait, do you want to come up and?
So, Peter Vanderdoes from Brattleboro. I'd like to add a little weight to what Rick Holsha said, and that is that the state archaeologist was called in the early 1970s to identify bones and remains found in Vernon, and he identified them as being Indian. In Vernon. There are also Paleo-Indian carvings underwater in Brattleboro, which you can find on Google Images. So my point being in this respect is that there would be a huge public outcry if, let's say that you had your ancestors in a cemetery and people were digging that up. You wouldn't be very happy. So that's what that's all about. Anyway, moving right along. I'd like to remind the residents of the town of Vernon the difference between released for any purpose, also called release for individual use, industrial use, and release for residential use. They're not the same, obviously. The difference is the difference between 100 millirem and 25 millirem. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepts 100 millirem for industrial use, figuring that a worker will only be on site for 8 hours a day or 1 shift. Residential use means that you can live there full time. The difference represents about 7 people per 10,000 who would be susceptible to cancer. This is according to the BEIR 7 report, B-E-I-R, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, which is a study accepted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Is there anyone else on the panel that has any words of wisdom before someone makes a motion to adjourn? Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I think Bill Irwin does. So moved.
Commissioner Tanner has made a motion to adjourn, and about 4 people have seconded it. So everyone in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Aye. Remember, November 16th, we will be back here. Thanks.